The drive to the cabin felt like stepping into another world. The paved road eventually gave way to a dirt path lined with towering pines that stretched endlessly toward the sky. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. No distant hum of cars, no chatter of nearby townsfolk, just the crunch of gravel under my tires and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was exactly what I needed. Life in the city had been suffocating me lately. Deadlines, endless emails, and the constant noise of existence had worn me down to the bone. The cabin, a hidden gem I'd found online, promised solitude and serenity. The pictures on the listing showed a quaint wooden structure with a wraparound porch and a stone fireplace nestled in a small clearing. The reviews were glowing, particularly about the host, Mr. Bolt, who was described as kind, accommodating, and helpful. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked even better than the photos. It sat perfectly framed by the dense forest, sunlight streaming through the gaps in the trees. The smell of pine and earth greeted me as I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. A rocking chair swayed gently on the porch, as if inviting me to sit and stay a while. It was idyllic. "Welcome," a voice called out, startling me slightly. I turned to see an older man walking toward me from the side of the cabin. He wore a plaid shirt, jeans, hat, and a straw hat that looked like it had seen better days. His face was lined but friendly, with a warm smile that immediately put me at ease. "You must be the guest," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Bolt. Glad you made it safely." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip. "Thanks, Mr. Bolt. The place looks amazing." "Call me Bolt," he said with a chuckle. "Everyone does. Let me show you around." Bolt gave me a quick tour of the cabin, pointing out the fireplace, the stocked kitchen, and the cozy bedroom with its large window overlooking the forest. Everything was simple but well maintained. He made a point of emphasizing the locks on the doors and windows, saying, "Not that there's much to worry about out here, but it's always good to be cautious." After helping me with my bags, Bolt left, saying he lived just a short walk away if I needed anything. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking and settling in, marveling at the peace and quiet. By the time evening rolled around, I was on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip below the trees. The forest seemed to come alive at night. Crickets chirped, and the occasional hoot of an owl punctuated the stillness. It was comforting at first, but as the darkness deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were pressing closer, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. A gust of wind rattled the porch railing, and I decided it was time to head inside. I locked the door behind me and started in the fireplace. The flames cast a warm, flickering light that made the cabin feel cozy again. I curled up on the couch with a book, letting the crackling fire lull me into relaxation. But just as I was beginning to unwind, a faint sound made me pause. It was distant, almost imperceptible, like someone shuffling through leaves outside. I froze, straining to hear, but the noise stopped. Probably an animal, I told myself. This was the wilderness, after all. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. I decided to brush it off and went to bed early, eager to make the most of my first full day in the woods. But as I lay there, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something or someone watching. The next morning, sunlight poured through the large window in my bedroom, momentarily washing away the lingering unease from the night before. The smell of fresh pine drifted in through the slightly cracked window, and birds chirped in cheerful contrast to my restless thoughts. I told myself that I'd been paranoid. It had been nothing more than the unfamiliarity of the woods and my overactive imagination. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. A narrow trail led me through the forest, the canopy above creating a patchwork of light and shadow on the ground. The crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the trees were the only sounds. It was peaceful, almost meditative, and for a while, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, Bolt was there, tending to a flower bed near the porch. He greeted me with the same warm smile, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Good hike?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied, brushing some dirt off my pants. "It's beautiful out here." He nodded, his eyes scanning the treetops. "It is, quiet too, just the way I like it." There was something about the way he said it, a hint of something behind his words that I couldn't quite place. But before I could dwell on it, he straightened up and said, "I'll let you get back to it. Remember, if you need anything, I'm just down the trail." I watched him disappear into the trees, his pace unhurried, almost deliberate. There was nothing overtly strange about him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cabin was once again bathed in the dim light of dusk, the unease from the previous night returned. The forest, which had seemed so inviting earlier, now felt darker, its sounds more menacing. I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled into the couch, determined not to let my imagination get the better of me. But as the hours wore on, the sense of being watched grew stronger. At first, I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Then came the noise, a faint scratching sound like fingernails on wood. It was coming from outside, near the front door. My heart began to race. I stood, the creak of the floorboards beneath me cutting through the silence. The scratching stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else, but the cabin was deathly still. Slowly, I approached the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. I flipped the porch light on and opened the door just enough to poke my head out. The rocking chair on the porch swayed gently in the breeze, but the woods beyond were pitch black, their depths impenetrable. Shutting the door, I double-checked the locks and turned back to the living room. That's when I noticed something strange. A single muddy footprint on the floor just inside the doorway. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't mine. I stared at the muddy footprint, my heart pounding in my chest. It was too large to be mine, and the edges were smudged as if whoever left it had been dragging their foot. My mind raced, grasping for logical explanations, but none came. The cabin was locked, the windows shut. How had someone been inside? A loud thud echoed from the back of the cabin, pulling me out of my thoughts. My body tensed, and I instinctively grabbed the heavy poker from the fireplace, clutching it tightly as I crept toward the noise. The air in the cabin felt oppressive, each creak of the floorboards beneath me amplifying my dread. The noise came again, a rhythmic tapping, deliberate and chilling. It was coming from the bedroom. Swallowing my fear, I approached the door, my grip on the poker tightening. "Mr. Bolt?" I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, pressing against my ears like a weight. Summoning every ounce of courage, I pushed the door open with the poker. The room was dark, but the faint moonlight streaming through the window revealed nothing out of place. The bed was undisturbed, the closet door slightly ajar. I stepped inside, holding my breath. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural chuckle from behind me. I spun around, the poker raised, and there he stood. Mr. Bolt. But he wasn't the same man who had greeted me with a warm smile the day before. His face was twisted, his eyes dark and unrecognizable. His posture was hunched, his movements slow and predatory as he stepped closer. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, his voice a chilling mixture of his friendly tone and something far darker. "See what?" I demanded, backing away toward the door. My voice sounded far braver than I felt. He tilted his head, his grin widening unnaturally. "You've been nosy. I don't like nosy guests." Before I could respond, he lunged. I swung the poker, the heavy metal connecting with his shoulder, sending him stumbling back with a guttural growl. Without waiting, I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. Adrenaline fueled me as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My shaking fingers barely managed to press the buttons. The operator's voice was a lifeline as I stammered out my location and the desperate plea for help. I could hear him moving in the bedroom, the thuds and scrapes growing louder. He was coming. The front door felt miles away, but I forced my legs to move, clutching the poker like my life depended on it. I reached the door just as his shadow loomed in the hallway. His face was no longer human, a terrifying mask of rage and something primal. "You won't leave," he snarled, his voice echoing like two people speaking at once. The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the tension. Bolt hesitated, his head snapping toward the window, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his dark eyes. He let out an inhuman scream before turning and disappearing into the bedroom. The door burst open moments later, and two police officers stormed in, weapons drawn. I pointed them toward the bedroom, too breathless to speak. They moved quickly, disappearing into the hallway. I collapsed onto the porch, gasping for air, as the officers searched the cabin. Minutes felt like hours before they returned, their expressions grim. "We've got him," one said, but the tone in his voice made it clear there was more to the story. They escorted Bolt out in handcuffs. His face was eerily calm, his eyes vacant. He didn't resist, didn't speak. As they loaded him into the patrol car, one officer pulled me aside. "Bolt has a history of mental illness," he explained, "split personality disorder. His family warned us about incidents like this before, but it's been years since he acted out." I nodded, my mind struggling to process everything. The kind Mr. Bolt, the man who had shown me around and made me feel at home, was gone. What remained was a monster I could never forget. I left the cabin that night, my belongings hastily thrown into the car. As I drove away, the dark woods loomed on either side of the road, the shadows feeling more alive than ever. Even now, weeks later, the memory of Mr. Bolt haunts me. His twisted face, his chilling laughter, the way he shifted from kind to menacing in an instant. I have tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just the illness, but some nights I wake up to the faint sound of tapping and I can't help but wonder if he'll ever truly let me go. The forest greeted me like an old friend as I stepped out of my car, the air cool and heavy with the scent of pine and earth. This was what I had been craving for weeks, a break from the relentless pace of the city. I wanted nothing more than to escape into the silence, to find a pocket of peace in this remote stretch of wilderness. The spot I chose was a small clearing near a creek, tucked away from the main road and surrounded by towering trees. Their branches formed a canopy overhead, letting only slivers of sunlight filter through. I couldn't hear cars or see any signs of civilization. It was perfect. I unloaded my gear, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, and a few days' worth of supplies. Setting up camp was almost meditative. I pitched my tent facing the creek, its soft babbling providing a soothing background noise. The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying the occasional call of a bird. I couldn't help but smile. This was the solitude I had been searching for. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced along the trees. The quiet was absolute, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. I found it calming at first, but as the night deepened, the silence began to feel different. Heavier. I brushed it off. It was natural to feel a little uneasy when you were truly alone, I told myself. After all, I hadn't seen a single person since leaving the main road hours ago. It was just me and the forest. After dinner, I sat by the fire with a book, its familiar pages helping to ground me. The glow of the flame softened the darkness around me, but every now and then I thought I heard something. A faint rustle in the underbrush, a snap of a twig. Each time I'd pause, holding my breath, but the sounds never repeated. When the fire burned low, I decided it was time to turn in. I zipped myself into my tent, pulling the sleeping bag snugly around me. The temperature had dropped, and the chill in the air made me grateful for the layers. As I lay there, staring at the shadows cast by the moonlight filtering through the tent walls, I started to feel it again. That heaviness. A strange, almost primal awareness that something was different. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually, the day's fatigue won out. My thoughts grew hazy, and I began to drift off, lulled by the steady rhythm of the creek. Just as I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness, a sound pulled me back, a soft murmur, faint and indistinct, but unmistakably human. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I strained to listen. The murmuring grew clearer, shifting into words. Voices. 2 of them. Male. They were close, too close. My heart raced as I held my breath, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. They weren't shouting or arguing, but their tones were low and tense, like they didn't want to be overheard. I couldn't make out the exact words, but the cadence of their conversation sent a chill down my spine. I stayed completely still, praying that they would just move on. But their voices didn't fade. If anything, they seemed to be circling, their footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. The night that had felt so serene now seemed suffocating, the darkness pressing in on all sides. My tent, which had felt like a safe haven, now felt like a trap, a flimsy barrier separating me from whatever was out there. The voices grew louder, and I could start to pick up fragments of their conversation. My ears strained to catch the words, and the more I heard, the harder my heart pounded. "We could just do it now," one of them muttered. His voice was gruff, with a cold edge that sent shivers down my spine. "Quick and clean. No one would ever know." The other man hesitated. His voice was softer, less certain. "I don't know. What if someone comes looking? He doesn't look like he'd be missed. But still." I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from gasping aloud. They were talking about me. The realization hit like ice water, paralyzing me with fear. They had seen me. Maybe they had been watching since I arrived. My mind raced, trying to figure out how they'd gotten so close without me noticing. Inside the tent, I felt impossibly exposed. The thin fabric offered no protection, and every rustle of my sleeping bag felt deafening in the silence. I prayed they hadn't heard me move. "We'll just wait," the gruff voice said, his tone sharp with frustration. "If he's still here by morning, we finish it. No loose ends." Loose ends? The words were like a slap, jolting me out of my paralysis. I bit down on the panic rising in my chest, forcing myself to think. What could I do? Running wasn't an option. I'd make too much noise, and they'd catch me. Staying put felt equally dangerous. My options dwindled as I realized how trapped I was. The voices faded for a moment, their footsteps receding. They were walking away, but I knew they weren't leaving for good. My mind raced, desperately trying to formulate a plan. If they came back, I had to be ready. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped it. The screen glowed faintly, and I cursed myself for not putting it on silent earlier. The sound of the lock screen felt like a gunshot in the stillness, and I froze, listening for any reaction. But the voices didn't return. They were still too far off. I typed out a message to 911, explaining as quickly as I could where I was and what was happening. My signal was weak, but I prayed it would go through. The message sent, but there was no immediate confirmation that help was on the way. The minutes dragged on, like hours. I stayed as still as possible, listening for the slightest sound. The creek, once a soothing backdrop, now felt oppressive, masking the noise of their movements. My ears strained to hear over the pounding of my heart. Then, faintly, I heard the crunch of footsteps again. They were coming back. I held my breath, my fingers tightening around my phone. "Forget it," the softer voice said. He sounded closer now, almost directly outside the tent. "We'll find someone else. It's too much trouble." The gruff voice grumbled something unintelligible, and then their footsteps retreated again. I waited, every muscle in my body taut as their voices grew fainter and finally disappeared into the distance. For the first time in what felt like hours, I allowed myself to exhale. But relief was fleeting. I couldn't stay here. Not after what I'd just heard. My body screamed at me to run, but the terror of making a sound kept me frozen in place. I sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, waiting to be sure they were truly gone. Every second stretched unbearably, my mind playing tricks on me, imagining every creak or rustle as their return. Finally, when the night felt still again, I began to formulate a plan to escape. I waited until the first rays of dawn began to pierce through the dense forest canopy. The pale light gave me a faint sense of courage, though my heart still raced at the memory of the men's voices. Every instinct screamed at me to leave as quickly and as quietly as possible. I began packing my belongings, my movements deliberate and slow to avoid making noise. Every zip of a bag or snap of a buckle made me flinch, my ears straining for any sound beyond the chirping birds and rustling leaves. The normalcy of the morning was unnerving. It was as if the night's terror had been a bad dream, except I knew it wasn't. When my tent was finally folded and my backpack secured, I took a deep breath and stepped onto the narrow dirt path leading back to the main road. My car was a mile away, parked at the forest's edge. It felt impossibly far. Every step felt like walking a tightrope, my senses heightened, alert for any sign of movement in the underbrush. The forest, which had seemed tranquil and inviting when I arrived, now felt suffocating. The tall trees loomed overhead, their branches interlocking like a cage. Every crack of a twig underfoot or distant rustle sent adrenaline coursing through me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the men following me, their silhouettes emerging from the shadows. The trail twisted and turned, and with each bend I felt a flicker of hope that I was closer to safety. Yet, My mind raced with dark possibilities. What if they had circled back? What if they were waiting for me at the car? The thought nearly paralyzed me, but the need to escape was stronger. As I neared the parking area, the sight of my car brought a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought me to my knees. But I couldn't celebrate yet. I scanned the area carefully, looking for any signs of movement. The clearing was empty, but the fear that they were watching lingered like a shadow. I unlocked the car with trembling hands, throwing my backpack into the back seat and climbing into the driver's seat as quickly as possible. The moment I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roared to life, and I felt a surge of safety. Fragile, but real. Gravel crunched under the tires as I sped away, leaving the forest and its terrors behind me. The drive back to civilization felt surreal. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed too bright, too cheerful, a stark contrast to the darkness I had just escaped. My thoughts spiraled, replaying the men's conversation over and over, dissecting every word. Who were they? Why had they chosen me? And what had stopped them from going through with their plan? When I finally reached a small gas station on the highway, I pulled over and sat in the car for several minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The reality of what had happened hit me like a wave, and I struggled to steady my breathing. I debated whether to report the incident, but what could I say? I hadn't seen their faces or even gotten a good look at them. All I had were their voices and the chilling memory of their conversation. Instead, I filled up my tank, bought a bottle of water, and continued driving. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment hours later. Safe within the familiar walls of my home, I should have felt at ease, but the unease clung to me. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the afternoon light felt ominous. That night, I slept with all the lights on, my phone clutched in my hand. The forest seemed a world away, yet the fear had followed me, embedded deep in my mind. I couldn't stop hearing their voices, their chilling debate over whether or not to end my life. Days turned into weeks, and though the terror of that night dulled, it never fully disappeared. I told a few close friends what had happened, but even as I spoke the words, it felt surreal. They assured me I was safe now, but I couldn't bring myself to believe it. I haven't gone camping since. The thought of sleeping alone in the wilderness, surrounded by shadows and unseen threats, is unbearable. The forest, once a place of solace and peace, has become a symbol of vulnerability and fear. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear their voices in my mind, the gruff insistence of one, the hesitant doubt of the other, and I wonder, what if they hadn't argued? What if they had decided differently? The answers will always haunt me, as will the knowledge that they are still out there, somewhere, waiting for their next loose end. It was nearly midnight, and the office was unnervingly quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of the air conditioner and the rhythmic tapping of my fingers against the keyboard. I'd been working late a lot recently. Tight deadlines and an understaffed team left little choice. Still, the solitude had always been a small comfort. The emptiness of the building gave me space to think, to focus. My office was tucked in a corner of the second floor, surrounded by cubicles that seemed like a labyrinth in the dim light of the overhead fluorescents. A lone lamp on my desk illuminated my workspace, casting long shadows that stretched and swayed with the faint movements of the air system. My desk, cluttered with stacks of paper and coffee-stained notes, felt like an island in the sea of the darkened office. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 11:47 p.m. Almost done, I told myself, leaning back in my chair and rubbing my temples. The screen in front of me blurred slightly, a reminder that I'd been staring at it for too long. I stretched, the faint creak of my chair echoing in the stillness. That's when I heard it, a sound just outside my office door. It was faint at first, like the shuffle of fabric against wood. I froze, straining to hear more, but the building was silent again. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination. Fatigue played tricks on the mind, and I was overdue for a good night's sleep. Still, the uneasy sensation lingered, a tiny knot of tension forming in my stomach. Returning to my work, I tried to focus on the spreadsheet glowing on the screen. Numbers danced in rows and columns, waiting to be reconciled, but my concentration kept slipping. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, Each time, it was just the familiar dark wood, its surface unbroken by shadows or movement. Another sound broke the silence, this time clearer. It was a faint, deliberate creak, like weight shifting on the old wooden floors. My breath hitched as my eyes locked on the thin gap beneath the door. The light from the hallway was faint, but I swore I saw movement. A shadow, maybe? Or had it just been the flicker of my desk lamp? "Get it together, James," I muttered under my breath, forcing a weak laugh to shake off the rising tension. But my voice sounded strange in the still air, too loud and too small all at once. Pushing back my chair, I stood and walked cautiously to the door. I paused, hand hovering over the knob, unsure if I wanted to open it or stay safely sealed in my small haven. The silence on the other side was deafening, amplifying the rapid beating of my heart. Finally, I gathered my courage and pulled the door open. The hallway stretched out before me, empty and dimly lit. Nothing seemed out of place. The flickering of the old fluorescent lights overhead was the only movement, casting faint shadows that danced with each flicker. I stepped out, glancing up and down the corridor, but there was nothing. No sound. No sign of anyone else. As I turned to go back inside, a faint knock echoed from the far end of the hallway. It was soft, hesitant, as if someone was testing the sound. My throat went dry. It didn't make sense. Everyone had left hours ago, and I hadn't heard the front doors open since. Who could still be here? I called out, my voice firmer than I felt. "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence answered me. The quiet was thicker now, like a heavy blanket smothering the air. I took a step toward the source of the sound, but hesitated. The rational part of my brain told me to turn back, lock my office door, and forget it. But curiosity, or maybe something closer to fear, pushed me forward. As I walked down the hallway, each step echoed unnaturally loud. I reached the bend near the break room and stopped, staring at the door slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat. The door had been shut earlier. I was sure of it. Slowly, I reached for the edge of the door and pushed it open. The break room was dark, its usual hum of the vending machine oddly absent. My eyes adjusted to the faint light spilling from the hallway behind me, scanning the room for any sign of movement. But it was empty. I stepped back into the hall, shaking my head. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was filling the void of silence with imagined sounds and shadows. But as I turned to head back to my office, I saw it, just for a second. A faint flicker of movement at the end of the hallway near my desk. Someone was there. The moment I saw the flicker of movement near my desk, my heart sank. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. My instincts screamed at me to turn and run, but instead I froze in place, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe my tired brain was playing games. But deep down I knew better. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, the overhead lights flickering erratically as if they too were unsure of their purpose. I took a tentative step forward, my shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor. My breaths were shallow and quick, every sound amplified in the suffocating silence. "Hello?" My voice cracked, echoing off the walls. No answer. As I approached my office, the familiar surroundings felt foreign, like a distorted version of the place I'd spent countless hours. The shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier. I stopped a few feet from the doorway, straining my ears for any sound, but there was only the faint buzz of the lights above. Summoning whatever courage I could muster, I stepped inside. The room was exactly as I'd left it, or so it seemed at first glance. My chair was slightly askew, its wheels turned at an odd angle, as if it had been moved. The papers on my desk were untouched, the computer screen still glowing faintly. I scanned the room, my eyes lingering on every corner, every shadow. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound like fabric shifting against the floor. It came from beneath the desk. Every hair on my body stood on end as I took a cautious step back. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but none came. Slowly, I reached for the phone on my desk, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. The line rang once, twice, before a calm voice answered. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" "There's someone in my office," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I think they're hiding under my desk." The operator's voice remained calm as she asked for the address and reassured me that officers were on their way. She instructed me to leave the room if I could, but I was rooted in place, too afraid to move. My eyes remained fixed on the desk, as if expecting something or someone to emerge at any moment. Minutes felt like hours as I stood there, clutching the phone. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights made me jump. I tried to focus on the operator's voice, her steady words a lifeline in the growing storm of my fear. Then came the sound I'd been dreading, a low, deliberate scrape, like nails dragging against the underside of the desk. My breath caught and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair behind me. The scrape came again, louder this time, followed by a faint, wet breathing sound. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. Whoever was under there wasn't trying to stay hidden anymore. I dropped the phone, the operator's voice still faintly audible as it clattered to the floor. My hands fumbled for the door handle, and I threw it open, bolting into the hallway. My pulse thundered in my ears as I sprinted toward the stairwell, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was in that room. I reached the bottom of the stairs just as the front doors burst open. 2 police officers entered, their flashlights cutting through the dim light. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly overtaken by the urgency of the situation. "There's someone in my office," I gasped, pointing toward the staircase. "They're under the desk." The officers exchanged a brief look before one of them motioned for me to stay back. They drew their weapons and moved quickly toward the stairs, their heavy boots echoing in the silence. I watched as they disappeared up the steps, my heart pounding with anticipation. I stayed near the front door, my back pressed against the cool glass as the seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity. Then, from above, I heard a shout. "Hands where I can see them!" A commotion followed, the scrape of furniture, muffled voices, and the heavy thud of footsteps. Moments later, the officers returned, escorting a man in handcuffs. His clothes were filthy and torn, his face gaunt and pale. He avoided my gaze as they led him outside, his silence more unnerving than any words could have been. One of the officers stayed behind to take my statement. I answered his questions as best I could, though my thoughts were still racing. How long had that man been there? How had he gotten in without anyone noticing? And most importantly, what had he been planning to do? The officer assured me the building was secure and advised me to go home for the night. I nodded numbly, gathering my things with shaking hands. As I left the office, the image of that man's hollow eyes burned into my memory. Whatever had brought him there, I knew one thing for certain: I'd never feel safe in that office again. The office was still and empty the next morning when I returned. The sunlight filtering through the blinds did little to ease the tension that lingered like a fog. I had barely slept, my mind replaying the events of the night before. The faint rustling, the scrape under the desk, the gaunt face of the man being led away in cuffs. I hesitated at the front door, my key trembling in my hand. The police had assured me the building was secure, that the man had likely entered through an unlocked maintenance door on the first floor. But their reassurances didn't ease the knot of unease that had taken root in my chest. Inside, everything was as I'd left it. My desk was slightly out of place, my phone lying where I dropped it. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the room itself remembered what had happened. I busied myself with tidying up, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But it wasn't just paranoia. Something still felt wrong. I sat down at my desk, opening my laptop to resume my work. The familiar routine helped a little, but I couldn't ignore the sensation of unease. My eyes kept darting to the space under the desk, half expecting to see movement. I finally forced myself to look, bending down to examine the dark space. It was empty. Of course, it was empty. I sighed, leaning back in my chair, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. As I worked, small things began to nag at me. A faint scuff mark on the floor where the man had been found, the slight tilt of the desk lamp I hadn't noticed before, a lingering, faint odor I couldn't place. By noon, I was no closer to focusing. The more I thought about it, the less the police's explanation made sense. If he'd entered through the maintenance door, why go straight to my office? Why hide instead of stealing anything? And why had he stayed so still, so silent for so long? I decided to check the building's security cameras. I wasn't supposed to have access, but the maintenance room wasn't locked. The office manager would probably give me a slap on the wrist for poking around, but I needed answers. The footage from the previous night showed the empty hallways, lit dimly by the flickering fluorescence. For the first hour or so, nothing happened. It was almost hypnotic, watching the stillness of the building. Then, just after 10 p.m., I saw it. The man appeared at the edge of the frame, stepping into the hallway from the shadows. He wasn't entering through the main doors or the maintenance room. He seemed to materialize from nowhere, his movements slow and deliberate. He wore the same filthy clothes, his posture hunched, his face obscured by shadows. I fast-forwarded, watching as he moved silently through the hallways, pausing occasionally as if listening. He stopped at my office door, standing there for what felt like an eternity before pushing it open and stepping inside. The footage didn't show what happened next. The camera angle didn't capture the interior of my office. I rewound and watched the scene again, looking for any clues about where he came from or how he got inside, but there was nothing. Unease turned to dread. This wasn't a random break-in. This man, whoever he was, had come specifically to my office. I shut off the monitor and left the maintenance room. My steps hurried. The building suddenly felt too quiet, the air too still. I returned to my desk, every creak of the floorboards amplifying the feeling of vulnerability. That's when I saw it. A small piece of paper lay on my desk, folded neatly in half. My heart skipped as I reached for it, unfolding it with trembling fingers. The note was written in jagged, uneven handwriting. "I'll be back. You're not done yet." The paper slipped from my hands as I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. How had it gotten there? The building had been locked all night. The police had swept the entire floor. There was no way anyone could have left it unnoticed. But there it was, a chilling reminder that whatever had happened wasn't over. I didn't wait to find out more. Grabbing my belongings, I left the office and drove straight home. The note stayed burned into my mind, its message looping endlessly in my thoughts. I called my manager and handed in my resignation that evening, unwilling to set foot in that building again. Even now, weeks later, the fear hasn't left me. I've moved to a new city, started a new job, and done everything I can to put that night behind me. But the sense of being watched remains, a constant shadow at the edges of my life. Some nights when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I hear faint creaks and shuffles, sounds too deliberate to ignore. And though I try to convince myself it's just my imagination, a part of me knows the truth. I'm not done yet. The carnival lights blinked and buzzed overhead, painting the night in streaks of red, blue, and yellow. I stood at my booth surrounded by the familiar sounds of children laughing, balloons popping, and barkers shouting their spiels. The smell of fried dough and sweet cotton candy wafted through the air, mingling with the faint metallic tang of the nearby rides. It was my third summer traveling with the carnival, and I'd come to find comfort in its chaos. That night started no differently. The crowd was lively, kids darting around with sticky fingers, clutching oversized prizes, while parents trailed behind with weary smiles. My job was simple: run the dart game, hand out prizes, and keep the line moving. Toss 3 darts, pop 3 balloons, and you could take home a stuffed bear or a tacky plastic trophy. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough to keep me on the road. As the evening wore on, I began to notice him, a figure lingering just beyond the carnival's glow. He stood by the edge of the parking lot, his form partially obscured by the tall shadows cast by the floodlights. At first, I thought he might be waiting for someone. Lots of people loitered around the edges, taking calls or finishing cigarettes before diving back into the action. But this guy didn't move. He didn't look at his phone or seem to be talking to anyone. He just stood there. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe he was a bored parent or a loner enjoying the atmosphere. But as I helped a young girl choose between a pink bunny and a blue dragon, I felt it, the prickle of being watched. My eyes darted back to where he'd been, and he was still there, facing my direction. My stomach churned with unease, though I couldn't quite explain why. The night continued, and the figure became a recurring sight. No matter where I looked, it felt like he was nearby. At one point, as I carried a box of prizes to the food stand, I saw him again, this time closer, standing near the Ferris wheel. He was tall, his silhouette sharp against the swirling lights, but I still couldn't make out his face. The shadows seemed to cling to him as though he was made of them. Back at my booth, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. I felt foolish. It was just some guy, I told myself. Probably harmless. But the nagging discomfort wouldn't leave me. The minutes dragged on, the once vibrant carnival beginning to slow as families packed up for the night. The crowd thinned, and the familiar buzz of energy gave way to an eerie stillness. Even the music from the carousel sounded distant, hollow. By the time the closing announcement crackled over the speakers, I was practically itching to leave. I packed up my booth quickly, tossing leftover prizes into a crate and wiping down the counter. My coworkers waved goodnight as they headed toward their trailers, their footsteps echoing faintly across the gravel. I lingered for a moment, taking one last look at the emptying grounds. That's when I saw him again, standing at the far end of the midway. This time, there was no crowd to mask his presence. He was alone, still as a statue, his head tilted slightly, as if studying me. My throat tightened. I wasn't sure what scared me more, the fact that he hadn't left, or the fact that he hadn't yet come any closer. Swallowing hard, I grabbed my things and made my way toward the staff lot. My footsteps seemed deafening in the quiet, and I tried to shake off the sensation of being followed. But as I approached the trailers, I couldn't resist a glance back. The man was gone. I quickened my pace toward the staff lot, my sneakers crunching against the gravel with each step. The humid night air pressed against my skin, but it wasn't the heat making me sweat. My nerves buzzed like a live wire, every shadow seeming to shift, every sound amplified. I told myself he was just some drifter passing through. Maybe he'd already left, finding someone else to spook. But the thought didn't settle me. It only made my stomach churn harder. The staff trailers were parked in a neat row at the edge of the grounds, their windows dark as most of my coworkers had already turned in for the night. I reached my own trailer and fumbled with the key, my hands shaking, despite my efforts to steady them. The lock clicked, and I pushed the door open, stepping into the cramped, familiar space. I dropped my bag on the small table and flipped on the overhead light. The weak glow illuminated the peeling wallpaper and cluttered counters, but it felt safer than the open lot outside. I locked the door behind me and pulled the curtain closed over the window, blocking out the night. With a deep breath, I tried to focus on anything else. My phone, a cold drink, anything to distract me from the gnawing unease. I opened the mini fridge and grabbed a soda, but as I stood there, the hum of the fridge seemed louder than usual, filling the silence with its rhythmic buzz. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting. I moved to the small window by the sink and hesitated before peeking out. The lot was mostly empty, the faint glow of carnival lights still visible in the distance. No movement, no sign of him. I exhaled slowly, letting myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I was safe. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a jolt through my entire body. I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. It wasn't the front door, it was coming from the back of the trailer. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. No one ever came to the back entrance. It opened to the dense trees beyond the lot, a place where staff rarely ventured. Slowly, I crept toward the rear door, my feet barely making a sound against the floor. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound firm. No response. I reached the door and pressed my ear against it, straining to catch even the faintest noise. For a moment, there was nothing but the muffled chirp of crickets. Then, just as I was about to step away, a whisper. It was faint, distorted by the thin metal of the door, but unmistakable. My name. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back, the room spinning around me. How did he know my name? My pulse raced as I scanned the trailer, looking for something, anything, I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a wrench lying on the counter, left over from a repair I'd done earlier that week. I grabbed it, my knuckles white as I gripped it tightly. The whisper came again, louder this time, clearer. "Come out." The urge to run nearly overpowered me, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. Then, without warning, the knock turned into a loud bang, the door rattling violently on its hinges. I stumbled back, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be polite anymore. I darted toward the front of the trailer, wrench in hand, and unlocked the door as quietly as I could. Throwing it open, I stepped into the night, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The lot was eerily quiet, the distant carnival lights flickering faintly. I took a shaky breath and started running, my feet pounding against the gravel. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Away from the trailer, away from him, away from the growing terror that seemed to chase me with every step. But as I reached the edge of the lot, I risked a glance back. He was there, standing just outside the glow of my trailer's light, his face still obscured by shadow. Watching, waiting. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the carnival grounds, where the lingering glow of the lights cast faint patterns onto the gravel. My chest heaved as I gulped in air, every nerve in my body screaming at me to keep moving. But where could I go? The carnival was closed, the rides shut down, the booths empty. The few workers who hadn't left were likely asleep in their trailers, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding outside. I ducked behind the ring toss booth, my hands trembling as I gripped the wrench tighter. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift around me, and I strained my ears for any sound. The faint rustling of leaves, the occasional creak of wood, the hum of the carnival rides settling in the night. They all felt like a countdown to something terrible. And then I saw him again. He emerged from the edge of the trees, his movements unnaturally smooth, his tall figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the carousel lights. He wasn't running. He wasn't searching. He was walking with deliberate purpose, as if he knew exactly where I was. I ducked lower, trying to slow my breathing as he passed the ring toss booth. He paused, his head tilting slightly as if listening. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain he could hear it. I bit my lip to stifle a gasp as he turned, his face still obscured by shadow, but I could feel his gaze sweeping the area, searching. I waited until his footsteps faded, then bolted again, keeping low as I made my way toward the main office. It was the only building on the grounds with a lock I trusted. My feet barely made a sound on the gravel as I reached the door, fumbling with my keys. My hands shook so badly that I dropped them, the clinking sound echoing in the silence. I cursed under my breath and snatched them up, finally managing to shove the key into the lock. I slipped inside and slammed the door shut, turning the bolt with trembling fingers. The office was pitch black, but I didn't dare turn on the light. Instead, I crouched behind the desk, clutching the wrench like it was my only lifeline. Minutes passed like hours. The oppressive silence pressed against my ears, broken only by the faint creak of the building settling. I strained to listen, every muscle in my body taut with fear. And then it came, the soft sound of footsteps outside the door. He was here. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment all was quiet. Then, the knob rattled. I pressed my back against the desk, my breath shallow and quick. The door held firm, the lock doing its job, but the sound of him testing it was enough to send a cold shiver down my spine. A single knock shattered the silence, followed by another. Slow, deliberate, each one echoing like a warning. Then a voice, low, calm, and eerily polite. "I know you're in there." I froze, my grip tightening on the wrench. The door rattled again, harder this time, but it didn't give. A long pause followed, and for a brief moment I thought he might leave. But instead, I heard something worse. A low chuckle, soft and menacing, as if he knew something I didn't. Then the footsteps retreated, fading into the night. I stayed crouched behind the desk, too afraid to move. Minutes passed, then an hour, but I didn't hear him again. Eventually, the first rays of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the blinds. The carnival grounds stirred with faint signs of life as workers began their day, oblivious to what had happened. I finally mustered the courage to unlock the door and step outside. The lot was empty, the trees still, as if the night had erased any trace of him. But I knew he'd been there. I could feel it in the lingering chill, the oppressive weight of the silence that had finally lifted. I left the carnival that morning, walking straight to the manager's office and handing in my resignation. The place that had once been filled with joy and wonder now felt tainted, its vibrant colors overshadowed by the memory of that figure in the shadows. Even now, as I rebuild my life far from the carnival, the memory lingers. I avoid crowds, avoid long shadows, avoid looking too long at the edges of the light. Because I know he's still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. And I'll never forget the quiet terror of his voice, or the feeling that no matter where I go, I'll never truly escape him. The house felt different when my parents left that evening. Normally, I loved having the place to myself, complete freedom to watch whatever I wanted, eat pizza on the couch, and stay up late without anyone nagging me. But tonight, something about the silence was off. It wasn't like the usual quiet after they drove away. This was heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath. I shook the feeling off and grabbed a slice of pizza, plopping onto the couch with the remote. The glow from the TV cast flickering shadows across the walls as I scrolled through the streaming menu. I settled on an old comedy I'd seen 100 times before. Familiar, comforting. I turned the volume up to drown out the occasional creaks and groans of the house settling. It was an old place, after all, and every shift in temperature seemed to make the floors and walls protest. Halfway through the movie, I noticed it. A faint noise, like a whisper or a rustle. At first, I thought it was coming from the TV, but when I hit pause, the sound didn't stop. It was so quiet, I could almost convince myself I imagined it, but my pulse quickened anyway. I leaned forward, straining to hear more clearly. Nothing. Just the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint tick of the wall clock. I shook my head and laughed softly to myself. "You're being ridiculous, Ethan," I muttered, grabbing another slice of pizza. But the uneasy feeling lingered. My eyes kept darting to the darkened corners of the room, where the TV's light didn't quite reach. I tried to focus on the movie again, but the humor didn't land anymore. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, their edges sharp and unnatural. I thought about texting my mom just to hear her voice, but the idea felt childish. I wasn't a little kid anymore. The noise came again, slightly louder this time, a soft shuffle like fabric brushing against wood. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned my head toward the sound. It seemed to be coming from the floor, right beneath me. I stayed frozen for a moment, my mind racing. Maybe it was nothing, just a random noise. Maybe it was an animal that somehow got in. A squirrel, a raccoon, something small and harmless. That had to be it. But a sinking feeling told me I wasn't that lucky. My breath hitched as I slowly leaned over the edge of the couch, gripping the cushions tightly. The space under the couch was dark, but not entirely. There was a faint outline of something, movement. My stomach dropped, and I froze, barely daring to blink. Two eyes stared back at me, wide, unblinking, and far too human. I jolted upright, nearly knocking the coffee table over in my panic. My brain screamed at me to do something, but my body wouldn't listen. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the far wall, my eyes glued to the couch. Whoever, or whatever, was under there didn't move. I needed to get out, now. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my phone, dialing 911. Each second felt like an eternity as the line rang. I didn't dare take my eyes off the couch. What if he crawled out? What if he came after me? When the operator's voice finally came through, I could barely find my own. "There's someone in my house," I whispered Day, the words tumbling out before I could think. "He's under the couch. Please send help." The operator's calm voice guided me to the door. "Get somewhere safe," she said. "Officers are on their way." I could barely hear her over the pounding of my heartbeat. I didn't dare make a sound, afraid of drawing the man's attention. Finally, I bolted. My legs felt like lead as I ran for the door, flinging it open and sprinting into the cold night. I burst into the chilly night, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted across the lawn to Mrs. Green's house next door. Her porch light was the only beacon in the darkness, and I pounded on her door with all my strength, praying she was home. The sound of my fist echoed in the quiet street, the stillness only broken by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Green in her flannel robe, her silver hair tied back. Her face shifted from confusion to alarm the moment she saw me. "Ethan, what's wrong?" she asked, stepping aside to let me in. "There's someone in my house," I stammered, my voice trembling. "He's under the couch. I called the police. They're on their way." Her eyes widened and she quickly ushered me inside, locking the door behind us. "Stay here," she said firmly, guiding me to the couch in her cozy living room. She grabbed her phone and dialed the police herself, her voice steady but urgent as she repeated what I'd told her. I sat there, hugging a throw pillow to my chest, trying to calm my frantic breathing. My eyes darted to the windows, expecting to see a shadowy figure outside, watching. But the street was quiet, the darkness beyond the lampposts impenetrable. Minutes stretched like hours. I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes staring at me from the shadows. Who was he? How had he gotten in? And why was he hiding under the couch? The questions circled in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, the distant wail of sirens cut through the silence, growing louder with each second. Relief washed over me, though it was tinged with dread. What if the man was still there? What if he tried to run? Or worse, what if he wasn't there at all, and I'd imagined everything? The flashing red and blue lights lit up the street as 2 patrol cars pulled into my driveway. Uniformed officers stepped out, their flashlights piercing the night as they approached my front door. Mrs. Green stayed inside with me, her hand resting reassuringly on my shoulder as the police entered my house. I watched through her living room window, my heart hammering in my chest as the officers disappeared inside. The waiting was unbearable. Every time a shadow moved, I imagined the man lunging at them from the darkness. I gripped the pillow tighter, my knuckles white. Suddenly, I heard a muffled shout from within the house, followed by a burst of movement. My stomach dropped. I couldn't tell what was happening, but the officers' flashlights danced erratically through the windows as they moved from room to room. Minutes later, one of the officers emerged, his face unreadable. He crossed the lawn to Mrs. Green's house and knocked on the door. I stood, my legs shaky as she opened it to let him in. "It's clear," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. "We searched the entire house, top to bottom. There's no one inside." My knees nearly buckled. "But I saw him," I insisted, my voice rising. "He was under the couch. I wasn't imagining it." The officer held up a placating hand. "We believe you. There are signs someone was in the house. A window in the back was unlocked, and there's a scuff mark on the floor near the couch. But whoever it was, they're gone now." His words did little to reassure me. Gone? Where had he gone? How had he slipped away so quietly? The thought of him sneaking out while I was running for safety sent a shiver down my spine. "We'll have a patrol car circle the neighborhood for the rest of the night," the officer continued. "In the meantime, I'd recommend staying somewhere else until you feel comfortable returning." I nodded numbly, my mind racing. My once safe home now felt like a stranger's, its shadows hiding things I couldn't see. The officer left, and Mrs. Green insisted I stay with her for the night. I didn't argue. As I lay on her couch under a warm blanket, the events replayed in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the man hadn't just disappeared into the night. Somewhere, he was still out there, waiting. The next morning brought no comfort. The sunlight streaming through Mrs. Green's curtains felt hollow, unable to dispel the unease that had settled deep in my chest. I thanked her for letting me stay and promised to return if anything else happened. Reluctantly, I walked back to my house, every step weighed down by hesitation. The house was eerily quiet as I unlocked the door. The police had assured me it was safe, but the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, as if the walls were watching me. I stood in the entryway for several minutes, listening. Nothing. No creaks, no whispers, only the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stepped inside, carefully locking the door behind me. The living room felt foreign, its once cozy charm replaced by an oppressive stillness. The couch sat there, innocuous, but I couldn't bring myself to approach it. My eyes kept drifting to the space underneath, even though I knew it was empty. I decided to focus on practicalities. First, I checked every window and door, double locking them. Then I went through each room, peering into closets and under furniture. It felt ridiculous, but the tension in my shoulders didn't ease until I was certain the house was empty. Back in the living room, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: faint scratches on the hardwood floor beneath the couch. Kneeling down, I traced them with my fingers. They were shallow but deliberate, as if something sharp had been dragged across the surface. My stomach churned. Had he been moving under there, waiting for the right moment? The thought made my skin crawl. I grabbed my phone and called the police again, reporting the scratches and asking if they'd found anything during their patrol. The officer on the line was polite but dismissive, reassuring me that everything had likely been a random break-in. He probably saw an opportunity and took it, she said. It's unlikely he'll come back. But her words felt hollow. This didn't feel random. Why hide under the couch? Why not take anything? The questions gnawed at me, each one heavier than the last. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my room. Instead, I barricaded myself in the guest bedroom, piling a chair and a dresser against the door. I lay awake, my ears straining for any sound. Every creak of the house sent my heart racing. The hours dragged on, each one more oppressive than the last. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, a faint, deliberate tapping. It was soft, almost rhythmic, coming from the living room. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. The tapping continued, steady and unrelenting, like fingernails drumming on wood. I wanted to tell myself it was the house settling, but deep down, I knew better. I reached for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator's calm voice barely registered as I whispered my address, explaining the noise. She assured me help was on the way, but the seconds felt like hours. The tapping stopped. Silence filled the house, pressing against my ears. Then came a creak, a slow, deliberate sound, as if someone were shifting their weight. My pulse thundered as I stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open. Red and blue lights finally flickered through the windows, followed by the sound of heavy boots on the porch. A sharp knock at the door made me jump. "Police!" a voice called. I scrambled to the door, moving the makeshift barricade aside. The officers entered quickly, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They searched the house thoroughly, their presence a small comfort in the suffocating fear. When they returned, their faces were grim. "There's no one here," one of them said, but his tone wasn't dismissive. The back door was unlocked, though. I hadn't unlocked it. I was certain. The officer placed a hand on my shoulder. "You're not imagining this," he said. "Whoever was here seems to be gone, but I'd recommend staying somewhere else for a while." I nodded, unable to speak. They offered to drive me to a friend's house, and I accepted without hesitation. As I packed a small bag, I glanced around the house one last time. It no longer felt like mine, its familiar walls now strangers. As I stepped outside, the night air felt oppressive, and the shadows seemed darker than before. Even with the police car escorting me away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man hadn't truly left. He was still out there, watching, waiting. I never went back to that house. Weeks later, I sold it, unable to set foot inside again. Even now, in a new town and a new home, I sleep with the lights on, my doors triple locked. The memory of that night lingers, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones we imagine. They're the ones hiding just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment.